Alaskan wood frog. This frog spends its winters looking completely dead because, for all practical purposes, it is. Up to 70% of the water in its body freezes solid. Its heart stops beating, its lungs stop moving, blood stops flowing. Ice forms between cells and in body cavities, and the frog just sits there, frozen under leaf litter, for months. Then spring arrives. It thaws, and within hours, it's hopping around looking for food, like it didn't just spend half the year as a frog-shaped ice cube. What's happening here is a controlled freeze. The frog floods its cells with glucose before winter, which acts as a natural antifreeze that keeps the liquid inside cells from freezing, even when everything outside the cells turns to ice. Ice crystals form, but they form in specific places where they won't shred cell membranes or puncture organs. The frog's body basically manages where the ice goes. It's not preventing freezing, it's deciding how and where freezing happens. To put that in perspective, if ice formed randomly inside your cells, the sharp crystal edges would tear through cell walls like broken glass through tissue paper. Your cells would rupture. The frog prevents that by making sure ice only forms in the spaces between cells, not inside them. Contrary to what most people assume, the frog's heart does stop completely during freezing. There's no faint heartbeat keeping things barely alive. It's full shutdown. The evolutionary advantage is obvious. These frogs live across Alaska and northern Canada, where ponds freeze solid in winter. Hibernating underwater would mean suffocation. Burrowing deep enough to avoid freezing would take energy they don't have, so they just freeze and survive it. This adaptation has been working for them for millions of years. It was here before humans figured out refrigeration. Woolly bear caterpillar. There's a caterpillar in the Arctic that takes up to 14 years to become a moth, and it spends most of those years frozen solid. The Arctic woolly bear caterpillar lives in some of the coldest parts of Canada and Greenland, where summer lasts maybe a few weeks, and temperatures during winter drop to -70 Celsius. It feeds during those brief warm periods, then freezes when the cold returns. Then it thaws the next summer, eats a bit more, and freezes again. It does this every single year for 7 to 14 years, before it finally has enough stored energy to pupate and become a moth. Most caterpillars finish their life cycle in weeks or months. This one takes over a decade, because the environment only gives it a few days per year to actually do anything. The freeze tolerance mechanism is similar to the wood frog. It produces glycerol, a cryoprotectant that prevents ice from forming inside its cells. Ice still forms in its body, just not in the places that would kill it. What makes this caterpillar remarkable isn't just that it survives freezing once. It's that it survives freezing and thawing repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times over the course of its life. And every time it thaws out, it picks up exactly where it left off. No cell damage, no memory loss, no dysfunction. The reason this works is that its cells are basically built to handle the mechanical stress of ice formation and the chemical stress of extreme dehydration that comes with it. And the evolutionary reason for tolerating such a brutal life cycle is simple. Nothing else wants to live there. No competition, no predators, just cold. Box turtle hatchlings. Here's something that doesn't make sense at first. Box turtle hatchlings can survive freezing solid, but adult box turtles cannot. The babies have an ability the adults lose as they age, which is the opposite of how survival adaptations usually work. Hatchlings emerge from their eggs in late summer or early fall, and if they hatch too late in the season, they don't have time to dig deep enough to avoid freezing over winter. So they stay shallow, and they freeze. Ice forms inside their tiny bodies, in spaces around their organs, and they survive it. Adults of the same species would die under identical conditions. The difference comes down to ice nucleation proteins that hatchlings produce, but adults don't. These proteins control where ice forms, keeping it confined to extracellular spaces and away from vital organs. The hatchlings also undergo supercooling, where their body fluids stay liquid even below the freezing point, buying them time before ice actually forms. It's a temporary survival mechanism that gets them through their first winter, when they're most vulnerable. By the time they're adults, they've grown large enough to dig deeper and avoid freezing entirely, so the freeze tolerance adaptation shuts off. Most people think hibernation and freeze tolerance are the same thing. They're not. Hibernating turtles stay cold, but unfrozen. Freeze-tolerant hatchlings actually turn into ice and survive it. That's a completely different biological process. The evolutionary trade-off is that hatchlings who freeze survive their first winter, but grow slower than hatchlings in warmer climates. Better to grow slow than die, apparently. Gray tree frog. Another frog that freezes solid every winter, but this one does it in trees instead of on the ground. The gray tree frog climbs down from its summer habitat in fall and finds shelter under leaf litter or loose bark, where it freezes for months at temperatures as low as -8 Celsius. Like the wood frog, it produces massive amounts of glucose and urea as cryoprotectants, flooding its cells to prevent internal ice formation. Up to 65% of its body water turns to ice, concentrated in areas between cells and organs where it can't cause fatal damage. Its breathing stops, its heart stops, blood flow ceases entirely. Then, spring arrives. The frog thaws from the inside out over several hours, and it climbs back up into the trees to start breeding. The thawing process has to happen in the right order, or the frog dies anyway. Heart and brain function return first, then breathing, then movement. If those systems don't restart in sequence, the thaw kills the frog, even though the freeze didn't. What makes this frog slightly different from the wood frog is its habitat choice. Tree frogs are built for climbing, not burrowing, so they can't dig down to avoid winter cold. Freezing on the surface is their only option. They've evolved the same glucose flooding mechanism, but they also produce higher concentrations of urea, which seems to provide additional protection against ice damage in their specific microhabitat. The gray tree frog lives across the eastern United States and parts of Canada, and every single one of them goes through this freeze-thaw cycle every year. It's not optional, it's survival. Water bears. Tardigrades are microscopic animals about 0.5 millimeter long, and they survive freezing better than anything else on this list because freezing is just one item on a much longer list of things that should kill them but don't. They survive temperatures as low as -272 Celsius, which is 1 degree above absolute zero. They survive boiling water at 150 Celsius. They've survived direct exposure to the vacuum of space. They've survived radiation doses 6,000 times higher than what would kill a human. They do this by entering a state called cryptobiosis, where their metabolism drops to undetectable levels and they curl up into a structure called a ton. In this state, they can survive for years, possibly decades without food or water. When conditions improve, they rehydrate and resume normal activity within hours. The freeze tolerance comes from replacing most of the water in their cells with a sugar called trehalose, which prevents ice crystal formation entirely. No ice means no cell damage. The evolutionary reason these abilities exist is that tardigrades live in moss and lichen, environments that dry out unpredictably. Cryptobiosis evolved as a way to survive desiccation, and it just happens to also work for extreme cold, extreme heat, and radiation. It's over-engineered for Earth. These abilities were tested in space experiments where tardigrades were exposed to the vacuum and solar radiation for 10 days. Most of them survived and successfully reproduced afterward, so freezing is barely a challenge for them. By the way, if you're enjoying learning about these creatures, I post content like this regularly. I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Thanks. Siberian Salamander. This amphibian has been found frozen in Siberian permafrost and successfully revived, which means it wasn't just surviving one winter. It was surviving years of being frozen solid. Siberian salamanders live in some of the coldest parts of Russia, and their freeze tolerance allows them to survive being encased in ice for extended periods, possibly decades, though the exact upper limit isn't fully confirmed. What we know is that they produce cryoprotectants similar to the wood frog, but their tolerance appears more extreme. They can survive lower temperatures for longer durations. Scientists have successfully frozen and thawed these salamanders in lab conditions repeatedly, and they recover without apparent damage. The discovery of frozen specimens in permafrost that revived when thawed suggests that the mechanism works even on geological timescales, not just seasonal ones. That's an evolutionary edge in an environment where freeze events can last years, not months. The salamander's metabolism shuts down almost completely during freezing, which conserves energy and prevents the buildup of toxic byproducts that would kill it during a long freeze. When it thaws, metabolic activity restarts gradually, and the salamander resumes normal behavior. It doesn't wake up confused or damaged, it just continues. The mechanism here is still being studied, but what's clear is that this represents one of the most extreme examples of vertebrate freeze tolerance. Most freeze-tolerant animals handle days or months. This one handle years. Antarctic Nematode. There's a microscopic worm living in Antarctic soil that freezes and thaws every single day during the Antarctic summer, and it stays frozen solid for months during winter. Plectus murrayi is about 1 millimeter long, lives in soil and moss around the Antarctic Peninsula, and deals with temperature swings that would obliterate most life. During summer, temperatures might rise just above freezing during the day, then drop well below freezing at night. The nematode thaws, becomes active, feeds on bacteria, then freezes again hours later. It does this daily. Then winter arrives, and it stays frozen at temperatures as low as -80 Celsius for months without any metabolic activity. The adaptation relies on rapid production of cryoprotectants and an extremely fast metabolic shutdown. The worm can go from active to frozen in minutes, and from frozen to active just as quickly. Most animals need hours or days to prep for freezing. This one doesn't have that luxury, so its cells are essentially pre-adapted to handle ice formation without advance warning. The evolutionary advantage is obvious. It's one of the only animals that can survive in Antarctic soil year-round. Everything else either migrates, lives in the ocean, or dies. The nematode's small size helps. With such a simple body plan and so few cells, there's less that can go wrong during freezing. But the frequency of freeze-thaw cycling is what makes this one unusual. It's not freezing once per year, it's freezing constantly, and every time it thaws, it's fully functional immediately. Spring Peeper. This tiny frog, barely the size of a quarter, survives being frozen in forest leaf litter across eastern North America every winter. The spring peeper produces the same glucose-based antifreeze system as other freeze-tolerant frogs, but what makes it interesting is the speed of the freeze. Because it's so small, it freezes faster than larger frogs, sometimes within hours of temperatures dropping below freezing. That rapid freeze creates unique challenges, because the frog has less time to distribute cryoprotectants evenly throughout its body. It compensates by maintaining higher baseline levels of glucose even before freezing begins, essentially staying preloaded with antifreeze throughout late fall. Up to 60% of its body water turns to ice, its heart stops, and it remains frozen until spring thaw. The spring peeper gets its name from being one of the first frogs to emerge and start calling after winter, sometimes while snow is still on the ground. That early emergence is possible because the freeze tolerance lets it overwinter in shallow leaf litter close to the surface, rather than burrowing deep. When temperatures rise, it thaws quickly and starts breeding immediately. The evolutionary advantage is reproductive timing. By surviving near the surface and thawing fast, spring peepers get first access to temporary breeding pools before other frogs emerge. That head start means their tadpoles develop with less competition and lower predation risk. The trade-off is that shallow overwintering is riskier if temperatures fluctuate, but clearly the strategy works. Spring peepers are one of the most common frogs in eastern forests. Antarctic Midge. The largest purely terrestrial animal in Antarctica is 6 millimeters long, flightless, and survives by freezing solid for most of the year. Belgica antarctica is a midge that lives along the Antarctic Peninsula, and it's the only insect endemic to the continent. It can survive temperatures down to -15 Celsius by dehydrating itself before freezing, which reduces the amount of ice that forms in its body. Less water means fewer ice crystals. The midge also produces cryoprotectants and can tolerate having up to 70% of its body water turn to ice. Its life cycle takes 2 years, most of which is spent frozen or dormant. It only has a few weeks of activity during the Antarctic summer, when it feeds on algae and bacteria. The rest of the time, it's frozen under moss or in cracks in rocks. What makes this midge interesting, beyond its freeze tolerance, is its genome. It has the smallest genome of any insect, which scientists think is an adaptation to extreme cold. A smaller genome means fewer genes to maintain, and less energy required for cell division and repair, which is an advantage in an environment where energy is scarce. The midge is flightless because wings are metabolically expensive and useless in an environment with constant high winds. It's basically stripped down to the bare minimum needed to survive and reproduce. Despite being the apex terrestrial animal on an entire continent, it's smaller than a grain of rice. That's Antarctica for you. Nothing about this place makes sense, and this midge fits right in. Alaskan Beetle. The Upas beetle, also called the Alaskan flatbark beetle, survives temperatures down to -100 degrees Celsius, and it does it using a mechanism that's borderline science fiction. Most freeze-tolerant animals produce compounds that prevent ice formation or limit where ice can grow. This beetle produces a protein that doesn't just prevent ice crystals from forming, it actively jams the molecular structure of ice, forcing ice crystals into shapes that physically cannot propagate. Ice tries to grow in its normal hexagonal lattice pattern, and the beetle's antifreeze proteins bind to the crystal surface and distort it into a form that can't expand. The ice is still there, but it's locked into a configuration that makes it harmless. This isn't passive protection. This is molecular warfare. The beetle lives in interior Alaska, where winter temperatures regularly hit -60 Celsius and can drop even lower. It overwinters under tree bark, where it stays frozen for months. The protein mechanism works so well that researchers are studying it for potential medical applications, specifically for organ preservation and cryosurgery. If you could prevent ice damage in human tissue the way this beetle does, you could freeze organs for transplant and store them indefinitely without degradation. The beetle doesn't care about any of that. It just uses the protein to survive winter. The evolutionary arms race here isn't against predators or competition. It's against the physics of ice crystal formation, and this beetle won. Basically, this insect looked at one of the fundamental problems of freezing, the fact that ice crystals grow and destroy cells, and solved it at the molecular level by rewriting how ice is allowed to exist inside its body. That's the kind of solution you'd expect from a science fiction novel, not from a beetle smaller than your fingernail. But here we are. If this sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing so you don't miss future animal content. Thanks for watching.